The piercing wail of car horns sliced through the morning air like daggers, followed by the desperate screech of tires against unforgiving asphalt. Daniel's steady footsteps toward the subway station halted as the catastrophe unfolded before his eyes. A massive black SUV, its driver slumped unconscious over the wheel, careened through the red light and smashed violently into a streetlight with a sickening crash of metal and glass. Time seemed to slow as the vehicle's frame buckled under the impact, the front crumpling like paper in a merciless fist. The horrifying symphony of destruction continued, glass shattering in glittering shards across the pavement, metal twisting with agonizing groans, and then, cutting through it all, the terrified screams of a child trapped within the wreckage. The acrid stench of gasoline permeated the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and the burning rubber that scorched Daniel's nostrils. Around him, pedestrians froze in horror or fumbled for their phones, but Daniel felt something ancient and primal awaken within his chest. His muscles tensed, his jaw set with determination, his eyes narrowing with singular focus. Inside the mangled vehicle, a young woman with blood streaming down her pale face clawed desperately at her jammed door, her movements growing increasingly frantic as she turned to the rear seat where her son's cries escalated to primal shrieks of terror. The boy, no more than 6 years old, remained strapped in his seat, his tiny hands pounding against the window, his face contorted in pure fear. Without a moment's hesitation, Daniel sprinted toward the wreckage. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his mind was startlingly clear. The first tendrils of flame began to lick at the crumpled hood, dancing dangerously close to the leaking fuel. Death was circling this scene, waiting to claim its victims, but Daniel refused to be a passive witness to its hunger. "Help us! Please, somebody help my baby!" the woman screamed, her voice cracking with desperation as she realized her door wouldn't budge. Daniel reached the rear door, his powerful hands gripping the twisted metal. His muscles strained beneath his skin as he pulled with every ounce of strength he possessed. "I will get you out," he promised, his voice unexpectedly steady despite the inferno beginning to build beneath the hood. "Look at me," he commanded the terrified child. "Look only at me." The door finally yielded with a tortured groan. Daniel reached in, his movements swift and precise as he unbuckled the boy and lifted him into his arms. The child clung to him like a lifeline, small fingers digging into Daniel's shoulders as he carried him to safety, depositing him gently on the sidewalk, where a horrified onlooker rushed forward to comfort him. But Daniel wasn't finished. The flames had grown hungrier, more vicious, climbing higher with each passing second. Without pausing to consider the risk, he turned back toward the burning vehicle. The woman had fallen unconscious now, her head lolling against the steering wheel as black smoke began to fill the cabin. Time was running out. Daniel wrenched at the driver's door, ignoring the searing pain as the metal, already hot from the encroaching flames, burned his palms. His skin blistered, but he barely registered the pain. The door finally surrendered to his determination, and he reached across the unconscious woman to unbuckle her seatbelt. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, he pulled her free from the wreckage. Her limp body felt impossibly heavy in his arms as he staggered backward. Sweat poured down his face, mingling with soot and blood. The heat became unbearable, a living thing that scorched his lungs with each labored breath. 3 steps, 2 steps, 1. The explosion rocked the street just as Daniel collapsed onto the asphalt, sheltering the woman's body with his own. The fireball leapt skyward, hungry and triumphant, but too late to claim its prey. Some people run from fire, others run toward it. And sometimes, in that choice, destinies are forever altered. The harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit pulsed against Daniel's closed eyelids like an unforgiving heartbeat. The antiseptic smell burned his nostrils as consciousness returned to him in painful waves. His body felt like a battlefield, every inch of skin a testament to his encounter with the flames. White bandages encased his arms and torso, the gauze hiding the raw, blistered skin beneath. "He's waking up!" a female voice whispered somewhere to his right. Daniel forced his eyelids open, the simple action requiring monumental effort. The world appeared as a blur of white and blue, gradually sharpening into the concerned face of a doctor hovering above him. Behind the medical professional stood a nurse, her eyes reflecting a mixture of professional detachment and human compassion. "You're quite the hero," the doctor said, his voice carrying an unusual gentleness as he checked Daniel's vital signs. "The woman and her son you pulled from that wreckage are alive because of you. They're recovering in another ward, both stable, both asking about the man who saved them." Daniel tried to speak, but his throat felt as though he had swallowed shards of glass. The nurse quickly offered him water through a straw, the cool liquid providing momentary relief to his parched tissues. "Can you tell us your name?" the doctor asked, pen poised over a clipboard. Daniel swallowed painfully. "Daniel," he rasped, the single word emerging like sandpaper against stone. The doctor waited for more, a last name, an emergency contact, any fragment of personal information that might help place this man within the tapestry of human connections. But Daniel offered nothing more, his eyes revealing a depth of solitude that made the medical staff exchange glances. "You don't have family?" "No one we should call?" The doctor pressed gently, his pen hovering expectantly over the empty form. Daniel merely shrugged, the slight movement sending ripples of pain across his burned shoulders. His face remained impassive, a mask perfected over years of keeping the world at a calculated distance. Days passed in a rhythm of medication, bandage changes, and physical assessments. The burns would heal, leaving scars that would fade but never disappear completely, much like the mysteries Daniel carried within him. Nurses whispered about the taciturn patient in room 514, the man who had risked everything to save strangers but seemed to have no one to worry about his own fate. On the 5th day, a tentative knock on his hospital room door broke the monotony. The woman stood in the doorway, her son clutching her hand tightly. A large bandage covered her forehead, and her arm rested in a sling, but her eyes blazed with gratitude so intense it made Daniel look away. "May we come in?" she asked softly. "I'm Claire. This is my son, Leo." Daniel nodded almost imperceptibly, his discomfort with their gratitude evident in the tension that suddenly gripped his body. Claire approached his bedside, tears welling in her eyes. "How do you thank someone for saving everything that matters to you?" Her voice trembled. "The doctors said we wouldn't have survived another 30 seconds in that car." "You don't need to thank me," Daniel replied, his voice stronger now but still rough around the edges. The doctor entered the room, clipboard in hand, interrupting the emotional moment with clinical efficiency. "Your recovery is remarkable," he noted, reviewing Daniel's chart. "But I'm concerned about your aftercare. You'll need someone to help change your bandages, monitor for infection." "I'll manage," Daniel stated flatly. The doctor raised an eyebrow. "You have a rather cavalier attitude toward your own survival." Daniel's eyes met the doctor's, something fierce and unyielding burning in their depths. "It wasn't luck that kept me alive," he said with quiet intensity. "It was choice." The silence that followed hung heavy with unasked questions. Who was this man with no connections, no history that he was willing to share? What forces had shaped him into someone who would risk everything for strangers, yet reject any attempt at human connection afterward? Claire studied his face with curious intensity, as if trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces were scattered across too vast a distance. "Some people go through life leaving footprints," she said softly. "Others move like ghosts, leaving only whispers of who they might have been." Daniel turned his gaze toward the window, where rain streaked the glass like silent tears. In the reflection, for just a moment, he seemed to be searching for something, or someone, he could not name. 2 weeks after the hospital discharged him, Daniel stood beneath the lukewarm spray of his shower, watching rivulets of water cascade down his healing skin. The modest apartment he called home existed merely as shelter. Bare walls, minimal furniture, nothing that spoke of permanence or attachment. Steam fogged the cracked bathroom mirror as he methodically examined the healing burns that mapped his torso like territorial claims of a battle fought and survived. His fingertips traced upward, moving beyond the fresh wounds to an older mark, a distinct birthmark on his right shoulder. Crescent-shaped and slightly raised, it resembled a small moon against his skin. Something about it had always disturbed him, though he couldn't articulate why, like a word perched at the edge of memory, tantalizing in its nearness yet impossible to grasp. A sharp knock at his front door interrupted his thoughts. Daniel wrapped a towel around his waist, water still dripping from his hair as he moved cautiously through the Spartan living room. Few people knew where he lived, and fewer still had reason to visit. Through the peephole, he saw Claire standing in the dimly lit hallway, her son half hidden behind her legs. Daniel hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob as something within him urged retreat. Human connections meant complications. Complications meant vulnerability. Yet he opened the door. "I'm sorry to intrude," Claire said, her eyes taking in his half-dressed state before quickly looking away. "The hospital finally gave me your address. I hope that's okay." Daniel said nothing, merely stepping aside in silent invitation. The apartment's emptiness suddenly felt accusatory, a visual confession of his deliberate detachment from life. Claire entered hesitantly, Leo clutching a singed teddy bear in his small arms. The stuffed animal had clearly survived the car fire, its synthetic fur blackened in patches, one eye missing, yet still fiercely protected by the child. "We brought you something," Claire said, offering a small, wrapped package. "It's not much, just—" "You didn't need to," Daniel interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "I told you at the hospital." "I know," she persisted. "But when someone saves your child's life, thank you, feels pathetically inadequate." Daniel's eyes fell on the boy's teddy bear, and something unexpected flickered across his face. Recognition, discomfort, a visceral reaction he couldn't control. His brow furrowed as if he were trying to recall a dream that dissolved upon waking. Leo stepped forward, holding up his damaged toy. "Mr. Fireman saved Bear too," he announced solemnly. Daniel knelt to the child's level, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. The burned teddy triggered something in him, a flash of memory perhaps, or the ghost of one. A burning sensation that had nothing to do with his healing wounds spread across his chest. "I've seen that look before," Claire said softly, studying Daniel's face with unsettling intensity. "It's the look of someone remembering something they never knew they forgot." Daniel stood abruptly, uncomfortable with her perception. "I should get dressed." When he returned, Claire was examining a faded photograph he kept on his otherwise bare dresser, the only personal item in the entire apartment. It showed a river flowing between steep banks, nothing remarkable except for the intensity with which he'd always been drawn to it. "Strange," Claire murmured, almost to herself. "Your eyes, they remind me of someone I met years ago, in another town, a boy with the same intense gaze." Daniel took the photo from her hands, returning it to its place with deliberate care. "Many people have brown eyes. Not like yours," Claire insisted. "And there's something about the way you—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I'm sorry. I'm being intrusive." As they prepared to leave, Leo suddenly reached out, his small fingers brushing against Daniel's shoulder, where his t-shirt had slipped, revealing the crescent birthmark. "Moon?" the boy exclaimed with childish delight. Claire's eyes widened as she stared at the distinctive mark. The color drained from her face, as if she'd seen a ghost materialize before her. "What did you say that man's name was?" Daniel asked, the question emerging from some primal instinct he didn't understand. "The one with eyes like mine." Claire's voice trembled slightly as she answered. "Michael. His name was Michael." Something electric passed between them, a current of unspoken recognition, of pieces beginning to align after decades of disarray. "Some scars," Daniel whispered, more to himself than to her. "Are memories the body refuses to forget." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of histories untold and connections yet to be discovered. Claire couldn't shake the image of Daniel's birthmark from her mind. The crescent moon shape against his skin haunted her thoughts as she sat across from Evan at a dimly lit cafe. The journalist's eyes widened with each detail she revealed, his pen hovering eagerly over his notepad. "It's more than just a coincidence," Claire insisted, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "The way he looks, that birthmark, something about his eyes. It all connects to that story I heard years ago about Margaret and the baby lost in the river." Evan leaned forward, his professional curiosity fully awakened. "The missing infant case." "You think Daniel could be—" "I don't know what to think," Claire interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But I can't ignore this feeling. There's something about him that seems unfinished, like a sentence missing its end." The next morning, Evan boarded a train heading north to the small riverside town where Margaret's tragedy had unfolded decades earlier. The journey gave him time to contemplate the extraordinary possibility. Could a man who saved lives be someone whose own life began with a mysterious disappearance? The town appeared frozen in time, its riverfront buildings weathered by decades of seasonal floods. At the local cafe, Evan carefully approached conversations about the past, about tragedies that locals might prefer to forget. Elderly patrons eyed him suspiciously until he mentioned Margaret's name. "Oh, Margaret," sighed a woman with silver hair pulled tight into a bun. "The case of the river, such a tragedy. They never found the baby." Evan noted the hush that fell over the establishment. Some memories, it seemed, retained their power to silence rooms even after 30 years. From a shadowed corner, an elderly woman with penetrating eyes observed the conversation. She stood slowly, her aged hands gripping a walking cane as she approached Evan's table. "You're asking about the missing baby," she stated, her voice surprisingly strong despite her frail appearance. "There was something peculiar about that case that few remember now." Evan motioned to the empty chair across from him. "I'd be grateful for anything you might recall." The woman lowered herself carefully into the seat. "I remember because it was unusual at the time. The missing infant had a distinctive birthmark, like a small moon on his right shoulder." Evan's pulse quickened. "A birthmark. You're certain?" "Absolutely certain," she nodded firmly. "My sister worked at the hospital when he was born. She told me about it. I never forgot that detail." The pieces were aligning with terrifying precision. Evan pulled out his phone immediately upon leaving the cafe, dialing Claire's number with trembling fingers. "The baby that disappeared had a specific birthmark," he said without preamble. "On the right shoulder." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "Claire, Daniel has one," she whispered finally. "Exactly where you described. Miles away." Daniel stood at his apartment window, staring at the distant horizon without truly seeing it. Since Claire's visit, sleep had evaded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of water, heard the rush of a river he couldn't remember visiting. The burned teddy bear had triggered something primal within him, not quite a memory, but the shadow of one. He pressed his fingers against the crescent mark on his shoulder, feeling its slight elevation beneath his touch. For the first time in his life, he wondered if this physical anomaly might be more than a random feature of his anatomy, if it might instead be a key to unlocking the mystery of his origins. Daniel had never needed a past before. He had been content to exist solely in the present, moving through life unburdened by history or expectation. But now, something had awakened within him, a hunger to know, to understand the fragments of himself that seemed to be calling from across decades of silence. The photograph of the river, the one possession he had always kept, seemed to pulse with new significance. He had found it in a second-hand book years ago and felt inexplicably drawn to it, as if the water flowing between those rocky banks somehow belonged to him. A knock at his door interrupted his reverie. When he opened it, he found himself facing a stranger, a man whose intense eyes mirrored his own determined gaze. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, his body tensing instinctively. Someone who found a story that you might need to hear, Evan replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he had discovered. Daniel nearly closed the door, but something stopped him. An inexplicable pull, as if fate itself were holding the door ajar. His stomach twisted with an emotion he couldn't name. Some truths, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. Some questions, once formed, demand answers with the relentless force of rivers carving through stone. And the time for answers had finally come. The photograph lay on Daniel's kitchen table, worn and faded, yet radiating an energy that charged the air between the two men. Evan had placed it there with deliberate care, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face as recognition, confusion, and disbelief battled for dominance in his expression. Margaret lost her son to that river 30 years ago, Evan explained, his voice gentle yet unwavering. There's evidence someone found him downstream. A baby with a crescent-shaped birthmark on his right shoulder. Daniel's fingers hovered over the image of the young woman cradling an infant. Her eyes filled with a joy that made his chest constrict painfully. Something ancient stirred within him, a memory beyond memory, an echo from a time before consciousness had fully formed. Why do you think this concerns me? Daniel asked, his voice rougher than intended, betraying the earthquake of emotions beneath his carefully maintained composure. Evan met his gaze steadily. Because the missing child had a distinctive birthmark on his right shoulder, a small moon identical to yours. The room seemed to tilt beneath Daniel's feet. Slowly, almost reverently, he pulled back his sleeve and stared at the mark that had always been there, a silent witness to a truth he had never thought to question. The crescent shape against his skin now seemed to burn with new significance. A brand connecting him to a story he'd never known was his own. I've had this my entire life, Daniel whispered, more to himself than to Evan. It never occurred to me it could be important. Outside, thunder rumbled across dark skies, nature's percussion matching the dramatic revelation unfolding within the sparse apartment. Rain began to pelt the windows, creating rivulets that mirrored the tears Margaret had surely shed for her lost child. Across town, in a modest hotel room, Evan's phone rang. On the other end was Michael, his breath audible and unsteady. You found him? You're certain? Michael asked, his voice cracking with decades of suppressed hope. The birthmark confirms it, Evan replied. He's here. He's alive. Michael's hands trembled as he ended the call. For 30 years, he had lived with the ghost of what might have been, with the phantom pain of a twin separated by cruel circumstance. The hospital had told them only one baby had survived, Michael, the stronger of the two premature infants. His brother, too weak to thrive, had been placed in an incubator. But the truth had been buried beneath lies and negligence. During a catastrophic hospital flood, the supposedly dying twin had been swept away in his bassinet, presumed dead. But in reality, rescued downstream by someone who chose silence over truth. Now, beneath a sky weeping with the weight of long-held secrets, Michael stood before Daniel's door. His heart hammered against his ribs as he raised his hand and knocked, 3 decisive sounds that echoed like fate itself demanding entrance. The door swung open. For the first time in 3 decades, the twins faced each other. Mirror images separated by a lifetime of different choices and circumstances. The silence between them vibrated with unspoken recognition, with the primal knowledge that transcends logic or explanation. Michael's eyes, the same deep brown as Daniel's, moved to his brother's shoulder. Without hesitation, he rolled up his own sleeve, revealing an identical crescent birthmark. You have it too, don't you? Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel swallowed hard, his typically impassive face now vulnerable with dawning comprehension. How did you know? A smile of profound emotion transformed Michael's face, tears shimmering in his eyes. Because I have the same one. Rain continued to fall outside, cleansing and revelatory. Inside, the brothers stood at the threshold of a new beginning, of answers to questions Daniel had never thought to ask. The emptiness that had defined his existence, his purposeful detachment, His solitary nature suddenly made sense. He had been incomplete without knowing why. "I don't know who I am," Daniel confessed, the admission costing him the armor he'd worn his entire life. Michael drew a deep breath, taking a step forward to bridge the gulf of time and circumstance that had separated them for so long. "Then perhaps we can discover that together." The photograph on the table seemed to glow with new significance. Not just an image of a river anymore, but the origin story of two lives torn apart and now, against all odds, rejoined. Some truths take decades to surface, but time cannot erase what blood remembers, what the soul has always known. As the storm outside began to subside, a new dawn waited just beyond the horizon. For Daniel and Michael, for Claire and her son whose lives had intersected with theirs through fire rather than water, the universe had woven their destinies together with threads of coincidence too perfect to be anything but fate. Some truths take time to be found, but they never cease to exist. They wait patiently in birthmarks shaped like moons, in rivers that both separate and connect, in the mysterious pull that draws some souls inexorably back to their beginnings. Have you ever wondered how many coincidences in your life might actually be threads of fate weaving you back toward the people you were always meant to find? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories that touch the heart. Thank you for watching.